Information discussed in this podcast may be sensitive in nature to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Everyone has an image of America in the 1950s. It was a time of economic boom as the country recovered from the effects of World War II. Advancements in technology were coming fast and furious. In 1951, Americans were watching television with shows like I Love Lucy, The Red Skelton Show, and The Lone Ranger. It seemed there was something for everyone now. 1951 also saw the first public TV broadcast in color, although only 2% of Americans were said to have been able to even afford a color TV set at that time. The media was very different back then from what we're used to today, and many families weren't aware of the dangers that may be lurking in their own neighborhoods. It was common to send your young children out to play for hours on end, just knowing that they would be back home and in the house before dark. The Klein family was no exception. They were living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was November of 1951. Minnesota is one of America's coldest states, and November brought in cold winter temperatures. On November 10th, 1951, Betty Klein's 3 sons wanted to walk to the nearby Farview Park. Betty said no, it was way too cold and too windy outside. Temperatures were in the 40s, but the wind chill made it feel much colder. Finally, after some pleading from her boys, she would relent and say yes. The oldest of the 4 brothers, Gordy, was working on a project fixing his knife sheath, and he told his brothers that he'd meet them at the big oak tree at the park when he was done. The decision of Betty Klein to allow her 3 young sons to walk to the park, and the decision of Gordy Klein to not go with his brothers when they left the home, would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. When Gordy did make it to the park that afternoon, some 3 hours later, his brothers were nowhere to be found. They were never seen or heard from again. Where are Kenneth Jr., David, and Daniel Klein? Hello, and welcome back to the Where Are They podcast and a bonus episode. This story has haunted me since I first encountered it. These young boys, they were only 8, 6, and 4 at the time, vanished so close to their home. And it seemed there were so many mistakes made in that initial investigation, in the initial searches for the boys. It was also 1951, so of course the case was handled very differently than it would be today. We don't have a lot of information on the case, and because of that, coupled with the fact that so much time has passed, there have been many theories and rumors as to what happened to the missing Klein brothers. In November of 1951, the Klein family was living on Colfax Street North in Minneapolis. Just 3 blocks from their home was Farview Park, a 21-acre park that overlooked downtown Minneapolis. Betty and Kenneth Sr. had 4 boys at the time: Gordy, Kenneth Jr., David, and Daniel. On Saturday, November 10th, the boys wanted to walk to the park and play. At first, Betty told them no, it was too cold outside and it was too windy. That day's temperatures were in the 40s, but the wind chill made it feel so much colder. Finally, after asking their mother several times, she relented and said they could go. Their oldest brother, Gordy, was going to meet up with his brothers later as he was working on a project and wanted to finish it. Kenneth Jr., age 8, David, age 6, and little Daniel, only 4 years old, would set off for the park around 1:30 p.m. Gordy would meet them later by the big oak tree. Around 4:30 p.m., Gordy was ready to head to the park and meet up with his brothers. He went right to the old oak tree, just as he had said, and waited, looking around anxiously for his brothers, but not seeing them anywhere. After waiting for a bit and looking on his own, he finally ran back home to tell his parents. His parents went out and looked for the boys, but found no signs of them anywhere. It was around 8:00 p.m. that evening when they called the Minneapolis Police Department to report the boys as missing. The department told the Kleins that they would drive around and look for the 3 boys. It was 3:00 a.m. when they heard from the Minneapolis Police Department again. They were just calling to see if maybe the boys had made it home yet. Sadly, they had not. Whatever actual searches would take place the following day, now November 11th, I can't say for certain. What we do know is that police went to the Klein's house to take a report around 6:00 p.m. that evening. This was now over 24 hours since the boys vanished, and this would be the police department's first visit to the Klein's home. The official missing report wouldn't be filed until the next day, November 12th, when the boys were officially listed as missing persons. The search began in the park, and it brought out many community volunteers. Scent tracking dogs were also used, and a scent was possibly traced to the Mississippi River about a half a mile from the park. Could the boys have ended up in the frozen river? Gordy said they never went that way. They never went down to the river. They would always stay in the park. The Kleins believed that if the boys did walk down to the river for whatever reason, that they didn't do it on their own. The next day, November 13th, a railroad worker found 2 wool caps lying on the banks of the river. The Kleins believed they were the hats that the boys were wearing. They were found downriver, almost a mile from the park. Police then theorized that the boys must have went into the river and drowned. The next day, they lowered the water levels and even dragged the bottom of the river in that area looking for any sign of the boys at all. Surely they figured that they would find shoes, jackets, clothing items, if not the child themselves. But they found nothing. On November 15th, despite nothing being found in the water, the Minneapolis Police Department closed the case, citing that the boys had drowned in the Mississippi River. The family felt that it was way too soon to close the case, especially since they had no evidence other than these possible hats. The boys had only been missing for 5 days, and the police had only considered it an active case, actually, since November 12th. How could they close the case just 3 days later with no evidence? The family struggled for the next few years for help in searching for their sons. Gordy remembers that after his brothers disappeared, life basically stopped for the Kleins. There were no more vacations or outings since all of their time and money went into looking for the boys. In 1954, 3 years now after the young boys disappeared, the Kleins moved away. Several years later, in 1962, something interesting and tragic would happen once again to the Kleins. The Kleins had a foster child that they were hoping to adopt. The boy was playing outside in the front yard when a car pulled up with 2 women inside. One woman hopped out and took the little boy, and they sped off. The Kleins would later learn these women worked for Children and Family Services and that they were working to help people who were not approved for foster care to get a child. They kidnapped this child and took him to another foster home that had been removed from their system. That child died 18 months later. Such a peculiar incident, and not much can be found on it, but what a heartbreak once again for the Kleins. Betty Klein had gone on to have 4 more children after her 3 boys disappeared. All boys. In fact, she was pregnant during the initial disappearance, but she never forgot her missing 3, and their birthdays continued to be celebrated, and they even bought them Christmas gifts every year. Every year, the Kleins would also run an ad in the newspapers on the anniversary of the boys' disappearance. They wanted to do everything they could to keep their son's name out there and to keep seeking answers, even if it seemed they were the only ones doing so. In 1996, a man from Arizona came across one of these articles and contacted the Kleins. He said that he was David Klein. The family spoke to him first on the phone. They were quite skeptical, of course, because they had received leads like this before, but this one was different. This man, now living as Tom Kempt, knew some details about the family that had never been talked about and that no one else should know, that no one else would know. He provided details of their grandparents' house and the grandparents' backyard and very distinct memories of playing there. The family was astonished to hear these details and flew out to Arizona to meet with him. They all took DNA tests, which ultimately showed that Tom could not be David Klein. One of the Klein brothers continues to believe, however, that Tom is in fact David, that the memories he had from childhood were too specific to be a coincidence. 2 years later, in 1998, a Minneapolis police officer came across the case and took a special interest in it. He pored over the reports and the interview notes and discovered something that caught his attention. A few people had told authorities about some odd behavior from one of the Klein's neighbors back in 1951. This man's backyard was also sometimes used as a shortcut to the park from the Klein's house. One person told the police that he was acting oddly in the days that followed the boy's disappearance. In fact, just days after, he had a new concrete basement poured. He also replaced his truck bed during that same time frame. When the volunteer searches were taking place and someone asked him if he'd be joining, his response back to them was, quote, "Those boys aren't worth looking for," end quote. He never assisted in any of the searches. By 1998, when these facts made their way to an interested officer, it was a bit too late. This man had passed away back in the 70s, and no remaining relatives could be located. 7 years later, in 2005, Kenneth Klein Sr. passed away, never knowing what happened to his 3 boys. In 2010, another officer took a look at the Klein's case. She and her partner took a special interest and began looking to match any John Does found in the area, any children found in the area that had not been identified, to the Klein's DNA. They didn't get any hits. It was also learned during this time that an evidence box, which also was the box that included the hats that were found on the river, had been lost or misplaced. Any possible DNA testing on those hats would never be done, which is really such a shame because those hats might have been able to tell us something. First of all, can we confirm that those were the boys' hats? Was there anyone else's DNA on those hats? The family had always believed those hats were planted or discarded there by someone other than their sons. 3 years later, Betty Klein passed away and, like her husband, was never able to learn what happened to her boys. Her other sons would like to believe that they are all united up in heaven and that their parents have all the answers now. In 2016, these same officers were able to get the case reopened with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, known to many as NCMEC. To this day, we don't have any additional information or answers as to what happened to Kenneth Jr., David, and Daniel on that cold November day back in 1951. There have been, however, some popular theories discussed in their cases. Theory number 1, the neighbor. He certainly did act oddly, and he didn't seem like a particularly nice man, but does that make him a possible kidnapper or murderer? Many believe that this is very likely, though. I know many are wondering if the basement of that home was ever searched even later, especially after learning of the new concrete being poured just after the boys vanished, and the answer to that is no. The residents of the home have been asked multiple times if the basement could be searched, and they have declined, which is certainly their right. But I don't know about you. If there was a remote possibility that there were 3 young children buried in my basement, I'd want to know. However, to this day, no searches have been conducted at that home. Theory number 2, Richard Fossey. Richard Fossey was working at Farview Park during the time the boys vanished. He left town right after their disappearance. In 1955, he was named in a murder plot in Chicago, a murder that took the lives of 3 young boys in the city, Robert Peterson, age 13, and John and Anton Schuessler, ages 13 and 11. There wouldn't be enough evidence to pursue those charges against Fossey, however, and they would be dismissed. Many people have wondered if he had any involvement in the Klein's disappearance, but if anyone did interview him or obtain any information from him at all, those records have been kept under wraps. Theory number 3, black market adoptions. While the world was thriving and the overall morale was high in America in 1951, there were some dark secrets lingering in the shadows. Black market adoptions were happening in record numbers. Many families, distraught over losing their sons in the war, began adopting boys through legal and illegal methods. This became a money-making venture in the 50s. Knowing what happened when the foster child was kidnapped from the Klein's home leads many to believe this is a possibility in the Klein's case. Could the boys have been kidnapped and given to another family illegally, given different identities? Now, it is certainly possible. The oldest child at the time, however, was 8 years old, Kenneth Jr., and you'd have to think that he would have some memory of who he was. Theory number 4, an accident. Did the boys indeed drown in the river that day, as Minneapolis Police Department believed? A medical examiner once interviewed in the case stated that he felt it would be a 1 in a million chance that all 3 boys went into the river in November, drowned, and were never found. It was cold. What would attract the boys to the water during that time? It would seem much more possible if it had been July. Yet there were scent dogs that tracked their scent there, and those hats were found downriver on the banks. Is there another explanation for both of that, however? The family has never believed that the boys went down to the river alone. Could there perhaps have been someone else with them? What do you think happened to Kenneth Jr., David, and Daniel? I do want to reference a couple of great sources of information on the Klein's case. First, Madison Roth did a wonderful write-up of the case for Rocket, Minnesota publications. I will link her article for you in the show notes. It is fascinating, very well done, and gives you quite an inside look to the Klein family and the nuances of that investigation at the time. There is also a multi-part podcast produced by Twin Cities PBS covering the case. It is titled Long Lost, an Investigative History Series. I'll link that as well for you. Both are great resources if you are looking for more information on the case. Other than that, there's a few lone articles floating around out there, but there isn't much published on these boys. It was said that media outlets were never interested in the story. Unsolved Mysteries at one time was considering covering their story, but then backed out later. No reasons were given. Talk shows also refused to cover the story. It was said that Maury Povich expressed some interest at one point, but later declined. It's really unknown why there was any resistance in covering their story at all. The family that is left still wonders what happened to the boys that day and still hopes that time will eventually bring some answers. Those sweet little boys were so young when they disappeared. They were only 8, 6, and 4. They left behind a loving family who would spend the rest of their years searching for answers basically on their own. It's hard to solve these cold cases, sure, but not impossible, especially with technology advancing more and more every year. Maybe one day we will know what happened to Kenneth Jr., David, and Daniel. Thank you so much for listening to their stories today. We will be back again very soon with another unsolved missing persons story. And until then, stay safe and hug your loved ones.